Welcome to another episode of Chorus Podcast. My name is Ji Heng. In the midst of international travel restrictions, people all around the world have been looking within, exploring their hometowns and discovering hidden gems that they have not discovered, even though they have been residing there their whole lifetime. Whether you have been a tourist overseas or whether you have been an explorer of a hometown, participating in a guided tour seemed like an ordinary or a checklist thing to do. And while today's guest also offers a guided tour, it is a very interesting and an eye-opening one, and also in a district that hasn't had quite a good reputation in Singapore. Having been featured on BBC, on Condé Nast Traveller, and is also a passion ambassador for Visit Singapore's Passion Made Possible campaign, I'm very honoured to have with us today Yinzhou. Good afternoon. How are you?
Thanks, Ji Heng. I'm great. Thanks for having us on this podcast today.
Would you like to introduce yourself to people who may not already know you?
Yep, sure. So my name is Yinzhou and I'm based in Singapore and I've lived here all my life. Where I stay, however, is quite interesting for most Singaporeans because it's known to be the red light district of Singapore. So I've been doing tours in Geylang for the past 7 years. And also for the past 2 years under the umbrella company called Citizen Adventures. So these days, we have actually 4 different tours around different neighborhoods, exploring different social issues as well. And it all started from Geylang, which is a place that I grew up in and am passionate about. Not just for the places that people know it for, which is good food and also the red light district, but also the more lesser known marginalized communities in Geylang, like migrant workers and sex workers as well. So that's where in the aspect of raising awareness as well as showing people another side of Singapore and Geylang not so often known, that's where I come in as a tour guide.
And I know that you also have another title to your role actually, which I would say is a social entrepreneur because you have created the Backalley Barbers and the Citizen Adventures as you were talking about. Could you tell the audience a little bit about these social initiatives?
Yeah. So I call myself the head barber of Backalley Barbers. Basically an initiative where we give free haircuts. It started 7 years ago as well in the back alleys of Geylang with migrant workers. Today it has grown to be about a team of 70 active volunteers going around different nursing homes, migrant worker shelters to give free haircuts as well. So that's where we are at these days. On weekends, we have roving teams go around to various sites to give haircuts. And I think that's also where we prioritize the skills-based volunteering kind of angle where people hear about social issues, they want to do more and learn more about it. Then the next call to action is to volunteer and really putting your time where your mouth is, right? Because the best way to help someone is really to do. And that's really a big cause of what we push for. Not just the act of cutting hair, but really through the haircut, simple act of service where we get to know and understand a population who lives quite different lives from most of us in Singapore. And that's also where during the past year with COVID and the impacts of COVID, unequally also affecting the lives of many of the migrant workers in dormitories, where we find ourselves in a good position and place to not just serve with haircuts, which is much more needful these days, but also in terms of the advocacy and the access to liberties as well as the simple joys of a conversation and what that brings. That's really what we hope to do more of.
Certainly, and I was reading some of your interviews that actually the Backalley Barbers was initiated when you were giving a free haircut to this guy called Basha from Bangladesh, am I right?
Yeah.
So could you tell us a bit about what was that specific and precise moment that led you to creating these social initiatives?
Yep, so Backalley Barbers, when it started 7 years ago, it was actually because of Basha, who is a friend from Bangladesh. He lived one back alley behind my house, and we used to hang out playing badminton. One day, I realized his hair was long, and it was not normally so long. And as days grew by, weeks went by, it became longer. So I asked him, why are you not cutting your hair repeatedly? And he said different excuses like, I like this style, it's a trend, and I want to save money. But at the end of the day, what I found out was that saving money was actually because of his family's medical situation back home. And so it was a simple thing, getting a haircut. But for him, he had to deliberate between, saving that few dollars to send back home or to give himself that little bit of comfort. And I think for that, I saw it as, as a friend, what was the simple thing that I could do? That involved buying my own clippers on Taobao and cutting my own hair, learning on YouTube before I offered him a haircut. And that was how Backalley Barbers started. But I think inherently, also more importantly, it's about what it means to be a friend to someone. I think when you really develop a friendship with someone, you care about them. Naturally, your inclination is, what can I do about it? And for me, maybe, I offered him to pay for his haircut, but he refused, like, oh, you are in NS, you earn less than me or about my pay, you should save the money for yourself, because national service, we don't get a lot of allowance, right? Then I was like, oh, but I save money because my hair is just short all the time in national service. And he was like, no, you should save it for yourself. And that was where I decided to do something that was more practical, that could sustain him as well as many other migrant workers in the long run. That was how we started giving the first haircut, but subsequently developed into an initiative because we saw that as really a good platform for conversations to happen.
And how many haircuts have you given ever since that inaugural haircut that you gave to Basha?
Well, I have an Excel sheet that keeps track of that for the whole team. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think it's around the range of about 400,
Wow.
which is not a lot considering it's the past 7 years. But I think thanks to the scale that we have grown, we've cut for about 4,000 to 5,000 haircuts so far as a collective. And that's really a lot more significant and beyond myself and what I could do as an individual. And I think that's really a power of movement and a belief where if you truly care about an issue or cause or segment in society, that's really the evidence of, that metrics of measuring like how many haircuts you cut for. So we don't obsess, like have tournaments of like who can cut the most hair or reward people who cut the most hair. But I think we prioritize a culture of giving haircuts for the understanding of communities as well. And that's why we are quite thankful for volunteers who are like-minded in that aspect.
I mean that passion of yours to give back and to care for people also led to the citizen adventures that you also champion, and you have done it in Dakota, in Geylang, and I was fortunate to have went on one of the Geylang tours back in 2017. But when I was on the tour, honestly, I was asking myself, and I will take the opportunity to ask you, what are some of the difficulties that you faced when you were creating Citizen Adventures, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah. So I think that the name Citizen Adventures came from the inspiration that what does it mean to be a good citizen, right? Like in Singapore, then the national curriculum in primary school, there's a good citizenship education, 好公民, right? And, it was always the rhetorical narrative that we should be kind to others, serve others, be compassionate, volunteer as much as we can. But somehow after you finish formal education, then your career picks up, your family responsibilities picks up. And I think not many of us gets to be aware or even have the opportunities to get insights into the worlds that others around us live in. And the role of a citizen for me, it was not just a citizen of a country, but I think as a global citizen, to care and look out for the people around us. And that was what really got me thinking about the role of citizen adventures and how it could be a vehicle to inform others of social issues, what's happening around them. But beyond that, also an opportunity for people to be involved through initiatives that we start. And I think one of the biggest challenge was like, it had never really been tried and tested before. Like models of tourism typically consider like mass markets, and I think there was no really market testing that was done for this segment of for me it was an interest in sustainable development. And so interestingly, I have a major in tourism when I was in university, but sustainable development caught my attention as the new way forward. And in Singapore, we know most of the tourism centers around like attractions like the Malayan or Sentosa. A lot of it is also mass marketed or driven by marketing and promotions. and that appeals to mass travelers. But for me, I felt as a Singaporean as well, it was an opportunity as to flip that around, the interest towards looking inwards into what we have done well so far in the past decades, where we've achieved these exponential growths, but also where we have fallen short in terms of our responsibility to others around us, and perhaps what could we also improve on, and take the opportunity to look inwards and reflect on that. So that's a new way of seeing tourism, beyond the veneer of Singapore's skyline and skyscrapers that we Google and we find that most often in Singapore's brochures, but really beneath that veneer of shiny skyscrapers, what lies beneath and what relates to us as humans as well in this new age of travel and travelers. And we've been really thankful to be seeing a lot of young Singaporeans who care about social issues joining us, as well as people who are more interested in the I wouldn't call it like off the beaten track, but it's really the equivalent of living life authentically and seeking a purpose in life. So that is also the crowd that we are thankful to attract.
I mean, you're too humble to say that lah. I mean, honestly, I did feel that the Geylang Adventures tour was very, very off the beaten track. That's the word that I will really use. So yeah, humbling yourself too much. And talking about humbling yourself, I actually read somewhere and I found it to be really surprising was that you went to Perth for a month to be a labourer. How did that come about, and why did you decide to do it?
Yeah, so I think the frame of migrant worker issues involve also like travel and getting new perspectives, and I think that's what I miss most now, not being able to travel and like see the world, appreciate nature, feel small, and also understand that sometimes the world does things quite differently, and I think that's also how we get new ideas and dream of like better futures for ourselves in Singapore as well. So the opportunity to go to Perth was quite random. I have a friend that was from Australia, and he runs like a mini construction business, just building sheds in Perth. And I was going there for a holiday, and then it didn't have a return ticket. So I just asked like, hey, what's up? What do you do for work, and whether I could join. So it just started out as like casual helping out, doing stuff here and there. Then eventually I saw it as a good opportunity to learn stuff as well. I was fresh out of army as well, so I think that was like a good time to transition to not go into a formal career of any sorts, but still get your hands dirty and use a bit more brain than you do in
Well,
army.
you still have the laborious mindset and having
correct.
the fitness to do it,
physical
right?
conditioning, yeah. So that was really helpful. I mean, the kind of conditions that we were working in, but it also got me to have a close-up look at the industry of tradesmen in Australia, right? Tradies, as they call it, and a seeding of that dignity and relevant pay scale that they have, where wages are comparatively higher, and even equivalent of like professionals like engineers or doctors, which really impressed me. And how different skill sets of specializations in Australia, whether you were a painter, a plumber, or a bricklayer, they had specializations which mostly involved locals, and that was really a refreshing take on these blue collar work that in Singapore we see done mostly by foreign laborers and at a very low wage. So yeah, that was a very refreshing take on like how labor and the value of labor, I think that we perceive it to be, whether blue collar or essential as we call it during COVID, was seen to be the more important jobs that people should be paid more for, rather than work from home. Not everything can work from home, right? So at the end of the day, how do we exceed the value, and also how we treat the populations in caring and making sure that they are safe with legislation that protects them. These were really some slices of inspiration that I got from Perth.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, we can say that we are very privileged. We have very privileged positions. I mean, just to sit here, to have a very comfortable studio to record the podcast is already in itself very privileged. And I know that it is in your ethos to uncover problems of social inequities and also the environmental problems. And I think it is more relevant today in 2021 with regards to the environment and sustainability. And so what are some of the learning points that you think that you would like to share to people that is watching and listening to the podcast today?
So I think the term like the social problems kind of like scares people off sometimes, right? Like where there's a negative connotation to it. But for me, I think the opportunity in there is that there is a urgency, you know, to action, and I think that's what we see for environmental degradation and a lot of the sustainability issues that's been mentioned. Especially in the media or in the global spotlight, they mark across different timelines of trends. And for me, I think it's good to have something that's trending, that's sexy for the moment, the spotlight is shown on. But I think the unfortunate fact is that often there's a media rotation cycle of like different issues that's spotlighted on, that's shown light on. But concrete change, you know, how does that really happen? And I think in my line of work, what I've been having the privilege to be exposed to in the context of Singapore is really compact governance, and how, you know, with the whisk of a wave of a hand and a wand, things change and things move. And we've seen how, like, with that policy and legislation front, things are also informed by sentiments on the ground, which are informed by grounds of people who are typically voters or people who care. And I think that's where education for me comes in as the baseline of advocacy, because if we have enough people who care about something for it to be changed, then that groundswell is what it takes for legislation to move. So that's like the first principle of why we focus on education. But I think beyond that, social issues are important, because the typical narrative is like sustainable development is consideration for the future generations and what we leave behind. But I think what's imminent is that the fact that we are facing these crises of inequalities, of environmental degradation within our generation already, that it's a bit too late to say it's the next generation's problem. And so as someone who cares about, you know, the earth, the world that we live in, and the people around us, I think it's also a good way of introspecting and considering the people that sometimes may have less because of the situation and circumstances that they are born in, or the lands that they grew up in, the nationality and passports that they hold. But the acknowledgement that we as people of privilege in Singapore can do something about that. And I think that's very empowering, because it's often easy to feel helpless with what you read online on the news. But it's not often that you can consider, like, what can I do about it? Yeah, so I think we are very interconnected, especially in this kind of like tech world that we live in. But a lot of the issues that are around us actually can be effected change, you know, from Singapore. We've seen how with the Myanmar political crisis in Singapore, we have a population of Myanmar foreign domestic workers, for example, and many of them are concerned with their family situation. And, you know, that level of appreciation of the interconnectivity helps us empathize as well with their situation. And that gives rise to the, you know, looking out and caring for one another, especially if they're far away from home. So that's really one of the shifts that we hope, you know, people to see, that interconnectivity with one another to be. And I think that's really a call for how our generation can be something more than what status quo looks like, and how that could also be informed with our positions of privilege that we have, and the education that we have been able to benefit from as well.
Yeah, I mean, one angle of education that I think at this present moment that we had enjoyed is whatever that we have received through social media. And I know that through your own personal page and also the page of Geylang Adventures, you have shared a lot of news regarding what the foreign workers face. And recently there was an article on mothership.sg that was talking about how the foreign workers in Singapore have been stuck for a year, right? So I thought that I will ask you this question, and to see how the new technology has helped you to propagate the ideas that you were talking about just earlier.
Yeah, so I think as all things, it's a boon and a bane, right? There are good things and there are not so good things past a certain limits. I think for social media, it's been great for galvanizing like ground support and for spotlighting issues. And especially at the start of COVID, when we went into a circuit breaker in Singapore, I think there were a lot of humanitarian perspectives that we took towards helping migrant workers because of how the lockdown was put into place for dormitories. There was a lot of adjustments that needed to be made by employers, by dorm operators, by workers that we wanted to kind of move in to allow them to move at such a short time at such a massive scale of 330,000 workers inside. So that was kind of the priority of humanitarian need back then, and social media was a great enabler of that response. And the equivalent response also comes with the fact that the devastation of COVID is across the board, across different strata of society, that we are able to relate better, that the plight of others, compared to us being stuck at home, was a lot worse, right? The kind of food that we have the privilege of ordering with the swipe of a finger on an app versus like the catered food and the kind of quality based on the amount that they could afford was vastly different. And I think that was what really got people to be inspired to want to do something about it, and also donating to a cause. So social media on that galvanizing aspect was really awesome. But I think what we are seeing, as what I mentioned just now, was the revolving of the spotlight on social issues. And we've seen periodically where trends of concerns of social issues peak, and there are a lot of public discourse and a lot of attention shown on it. And then the news cycle shift, and then things move, and then we forget. So I think that's also how we have led to this 1 year mark of circuit breaker, but migrant workers are still stuck inside for those in dormitories. And it's also unfortunate that there is very little cross-pollination of communication between migrant workers and whoever else is outside in Singapore. And so for us, it's really not so much of advocating that workers have their liberties restored, but I think it's also advocating for Singaporeans to be aware that workers are still inside at what cost. And it's also because of the collective safety that we say COVID should render us safe with the workers being locked up in dorms, but also the understanding that it's really a context of how it's easier perhaps on a policy level to dictate that we lock workers up versus, if we were to do that for the community population, I'm sure people will be up in arms right now. So I think it's a disparity between treatment as well as the perspective of rightful access, and what are the limits to trade-offs that we need to make. And I think this is something that is a very deep discourse that we haven't had on a societal level. This doesn't include just this issue, but many other social and environmental issues in Singapore as well. So I think that maturity as a society to have that discussion is still not there. But in small pockets, with the participants on the tour, I think that's where we have the privilege to share more about and exchange insights about.
Great. And I just thought of the fact that whatever that you mentioned shows that you want to continue to grow in this respect, and you want to reach out to more people through this. And I know one of the things that you did in the recent years was to take up a master's degree for tri-sector collaboration at a prestigious university in Singapore called Singapore Management University. And I read it was a discipline to help the next generation leaders to innovatively co-create a more sustainable and inclusive future. So would you like to talk about how and why did you decide to take up this discipline?
Yeah, it didn't seem apparent to me, but I'm quite concerned about the amount of information of me online now. Now that you're mentioning
I have to do my homework.
You have done it very well. Yeah, a bit too well. Yeah. So I think the masters was a interesting angle, to approach it through the tri-sectors as a point of analysis, and how collaboration is inherently what is required to solve complex and global problems, right? Unfortunately, my course was actually my batch was the last batch in the course. The course has since closed down. So for those who are thinking of signing up, I'm sorry, it's not available anymore. Look for SMU to find out more information. Yeah. But what I definitely benefited from it was the perspective of, I think, how in the tri-sector, the three sectors are equally, if not more important, to collaborate than to work in their own silos. And I think that's where I mentioned, the perspective of policy, legislation change, and requiring groundswell, as well as private sector support and partnerships. These are really the holy trinity of, solving problems. But idealistic as it sounds, collaboration in that master's name inherently also is on the bias that people collaborate. But people collaborate with different interests at heart. So as you probably know, it's not easy to work with people all the time, but I think it's often understanding the levers of incentives that people have, and to be mutually incentivized to work with one another. And I think that's, for me, one of also the takeaways of how do I allow different parties to be incentivized to partner, and how do I create incentives as well for them, and then collectively do stuff and get shit done. Yeah.
I thought I would segue very nicely into the next topic, and it's also on what this podcast is about. It's on sustainability in travel and tourism, and with your degree and your experience in tourism, and also your personal interest in sustainability, where do you think as a global population we are at in terms of achieving sustainable goals?
So what I hear is that there are two parts to the question. One is like specific to travel, sustainability specific to travel. The other one is the SDG goals, right? So I think in terms of the SDG goals, they're as good as a guideline as anything else is. It's like, what are the 7 codes of living a life? What are the deadly sins? These kind of principles. They are good guidelines to have, to consider. But at the end of the day, it's really what are people doing about it. And I think when you look at sustainable travel as an aspect where we understand what people are considering in terms of sustainability in travel, we are seeing the rise of people who are more inward looking, exploring their own heritage, their own history, their own lands, their own identity. And I think these are important features of understanding that the new wave of tourism isn't one that's targeted at mass market, isn't one that is looking at attractions or artificially stimulating an economy with like the Malayan or the example of an attraction, and it's not always about these big spotlights that's shining on major attractions. And I think we have seen in the case of other countries like Thailand, where community-based tourism models, asset-based community development models have greatly benefited and sustained the communities a lot better and longer term than many other previous forms of tourism have. And we are seeing also the rise of the democratization of technology, whether it's access to internet, or being able to market your own products, being able to have tools and learn on online courses how to use these tools. I think that has really democratized the use of technology, and that has enabled things that communities previously were not able to do for themselves, to do on their own. And I think that's also what the new wave of tourism is concerned about, right? The impacts to local communities, and how to give back, and to also allow that community to not just sustain through financial means of tourism, but to thrive through the activity itself. And I think that's where I see the tours in the communities that we do often, something that I'm challenged by. How do I create more value and derive more impact socially in partnership with the communities that we serve? And these are always mutually cooperative and mutually beneficial terms that we are engaging on. And I think this is one that considers the value derivation of the land or the community that we partner with. So sustainability is a very broad word again, but it looks at really what exactly do you want to do with the aspect that you're focusing on.
Thank you for touching on the sustainability. In fact, that's why the podcast aims to interview different personalities and from different aspects of life, really, just to be able to talk about such a huge spectrum of sustainability. And Yinzhou, for example, who is with us today, is talking about more on how to support local communities. And I thought of asking you, is there an example or a place or somewhere that you have visited, or a program that you have participated that exhibited these sustainability values?
Yeah, I think in terms of like so we've experimented with a lot of products, a lot of programs, and a lot of these were like prototypes of ideas of how do we showcase social issues to allow for a deeper understanding as well as again the long-term action and the possibility of physical involvement. So in one of the prototypes about 3 years back, we did this series of camps, deep diving on around social issues in Singapore. So we actually did 2-day 1-night camps on environment, inequality, and integration. And these 2-day 1-night just focus specifically on one particular topic and unpacks it from the different perspectives of the stakeholders, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, the civil society perspective of what solutions look like, as well as academia. So I think that was really interesting for me, because the idea of like engaging social issues is often like what people focus on. It's like, what's the activity that I'm gonna do with the beneficiary that I'm serving? But often I think it's not about taking enough time to understand the problem and to also appreciate our interconnectivity to it. So that is something that I really enjoyed in the process of creating the camps. And although it wasn't something that I had in mind to understand it in such a complex way, but I think in the course of the experiencing, meeting the stakeholders, understanding the work they do, it really helped develop the full flavor of what a social issue actually represented. And it wasn't about the theme of inequality or environmental issue anymore, but it was about us, about how we operate as a society, about how we protect, legislate, and how we can always do better. And that really got me thinking about sustainability as the notion of something that's fast evolving, that's always changing. And it's not like a step where you get there and I'm truly sustainable. Yeah, I think based on the times and changes in populations and generations, we need to often be challenged to think about that stewardship. And that's where I really appreciated that flavor. Yeah. Sounds like wine.
I thought I would dive deeper into the main work that you do, and which is also something that I know you through, which is Geylang Adventures, as we all know. And as you also had mentioned a bit earlier, is that Geylang in Singapore is indeed a messy area. It's a sketchy area. It is also where the red light district of Singapore is being situated at. But it is also a place that you grew up in and kind of was the starting point of all the adventures that you have. You also mentioned that Geylang is a true melting pot of Singapore, which I have to agree with all the food and all the people who are working there and commuting there on a daily basis, and that it is what you want the world to see. So I thought of asking you, what are some of the fondest memories that you had since childhood, and what would you recommend the world to see in Geylang?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. So I think for like childhood memory, I think one of my favorites would definitely be the people that I've met along the way. So in poly and university, I was doing my reports and papers from the dodgiest beer gardens in Geylang, and they were known for having a lot of vibrant nightlife in a different nature.
That's very well put.
Yeah, and for me, actually, it was a great immersive way of just being exposed to people whom we normally think negatively, but also then understanding them for who they are and seeing also the positives in them. So I think for me, it was that time period where I really understood like communities for their sacrifices that they've made to come here, their challenges that they face when they're here, the kind of like what goes on in their heads, the psyche, and kind of decisions that they make, or the choice of career that they are in, and even for some of the customers, like motivations and what are some reasons why they may be engaging in such activities which would be frowned upon in society. And for me, it was really an eye-opener to be just hanging out with them and being like a fly on the wall, but yet participating in their conversations and really, really enjoying myself a bit too much. At some point of time, I thought I might just become a beer drinking 20-year-old boy in a beer garden surrounded with lots of dodgy uncles. But yeah, I think that really got me to think deeper about Geylang as a community that's not just multifaceted or diverse for its food options, but then representative of the community of people as well that were equally diverse. And I think what struck me was how, for example, in the morning I'll see the construction workers waiting for their lorries to get sent to work. And then at night, in the evening, I'll see the sex workers getting out of the apartments and then waiting for the men to pick them up to go to work. And then that was always a contrasting, narrative of, on both ends, spectrums of both migrant workers, both for construction or for sex work, coming to Singapore and earning a living, not just for themselves, but for their family. But for many of us who view and perceive them to be also just another person amongst us. And I think I had that privilege of experiencing that living in Geylang, because my neighbors were, these populations. And unlike my friends who would, ask me about like what's my favorite brothel or sex workers nationality, I got that all the time in national service, like recommendations for favorite brothels or bars. It was really about who they are as people, look at them and like,
Yeah, I mean, we both have been through national service, which, by the way, national service is it's a compulsory 2-year military service that Singapore mandates all Singapore men above 18 years old to participate. So, if you could say one unique selling point about Geylang Adventures, what would that be?
Oh, I thought about Geylang.
Geylang Adventures.
Okay, yeah. I think, I think the fortunate thing is we haven't needed to market ourselves. So maybe that's why it doesn't come intuitively like what should I promote. But I think what I can say is what I enjoy sharing about is, especially for Singaporeans, like a different perspective of a place that's familiar to most of us, right? If not all Singaporeans, because we come here all the time for good food. So when I first conceptualized the tour, people thought I was crazy. Why would I pay you money to take me around a place that I can take a bus or train to and walk around myself? And I know a lot of people that go to Geylang to find sex workers, for example, and they're like, oh, I can do a better tour than you for sure. So I think that understanding of Geylang, I think reinforces the stereotypes, and for me that's really my the joy of my work, to share about these other perspectives, to shed light into inevitably the communities as well that are affected by the stereotypes that we place upon the place, and that's where I think for me the question, the existential question is, right, are we understanding a place for its people, or, do we impose these perspectives on the place for its reputation? So Geylang Adventures is the methodology that I've taken and transplanted to other neighborhoods as well. Not so much as geographical concerns anymore, but more of the social issues that manifest in these areas, and how do we, as someone living in Singapore, how we connected to them, and how can we also do something about it.
And I mean, you have lived in Geylang all your life, and I'm sure that you have seen so many improvements and marked changes to the district and the community over the last 30 years. And a word actually came to me last year, and it was called gentrification. And I remember that was a word that came up a lot when I was visiting Geylang through the Geylang Adventures. Do you see gentrification as a positive or a negative thing?
So yeah, gentrification, some people see it like a bad word, right? Like, oh, it's gentrify, I don't like this place anymore. But I think in the line of Singapore's development, it is a consequence of development. It's a trade-off of what we enjoy in Singapore today. What we have, it's a result of refreshing the old to become new, things that are relevant and exciting and attracting and appealing to investors as well, right? So I think that's the beauty of Singapore's developmental narrative. However, what has prevented Geylang from experiencing that kind of rapid gentrification that other neighborhoods have is really because of its presence and significance as a red light district. It is the reason why gentrification is a lot slower. Developing a red light district it's a bit counterintuitive. People wouldn't want to think of setting up business or customer-facing establishments in the red light district. So I think that has been the trend of Geylang in the past years. But the result of that is that things are not always changing so obviously. But what we're seeing is new communities coming in. For example, in the type of housing that we have in Geylang, many of the new condominiums have attracted a new appeal of expats and younger Singaporeans who don't mind living in that kind of environments. We've also seen how crime rates in Geylang have decreased over the years with the help of more enforcement and technological advancements in security. So these have resulted in the sense of safety and perception of Geylang being shifted, and people are a bit more open to the idea today of going there, having food there, or even living there. And I think that's slowly shifting. So, I mean, the tour that we went on in 2017 would probably be a lot different today with the kind of landscape that Geylang is seeing. It's always shifting, still a lot slower than other neighborhoods in Singapore.
How do you feel about gentrification with regards to sustainability?
Well, I think it's inevitable in the course of Singapore's development. For sustainability, I think it's always seeing the needs of the community or the users of the community and understanding how old spaces could be rejuvenated for the purpose of these new needs. So the term, I think, in architecture that they use is adaptive reuse. How could old spaces be rethought to not be completely demolished and redesigned and rebuilt, but to just be altered and to adapt, as a reuse function to needs of the new community. And we've seen some good examples of that in Singapore with old buildings being conserved, new developments being built around it, and then conserving it as like a clubhouse of sorts in a new condominium. But, that's still a very token level of like conservation. I think the challenge is adapting it to consider the identity of that place that used to be for the previous generation, yet adapting enough new functions to excite other people to come in as well. So gentrification should be seen as that opportunity in sustainability, I feel, to rejuvenate its appeal. And yeah, we do have some places like that in Singapore, but with varying degrees of success in attracting new communities.
Talking about having that influence in the world, I'm sure that your actions have inspired people from around the world, really. And I thought we should engage in a more global, in this sustainability subject in a more global perspective. The scattered civic engagement of millions of people is not enough to change a society stuck in the race for economic performance. How do you think we can unite forces, change modes of action, and mobilize to achieve a real tipping point?
Wow.
Ta-da.
It's a big question. Yeah, so I think we start from like the motivation to change, right? I think the tipping point is a good analogy to call it. Like, we used to consider like the next generation will suffer because of the actions or inactions of this generation. And for me, I think the tipping point will be achieved if we continue status quo and continue sitting at the sidelines. And there's a perspective of the cost of inaction that we advocate often. So I think it's the call to be more conscious. I think in how we consume, there's a movement on conscious consumerism, conscious travel, conscious way of living, where we start understanding how the products that we buy, the clothes that we wear, the things that we consume does have impacts downstream in terms of how it benefits, people that made it, who were part of the process of harvesting it and generating it, and what kind of profits and where does it go to, in whose hands as well, right? So the call for equality and mutuality is an interesting concept that I think many of the younger people are also embracing, the woke generation, right, as they call it. And I think that's really been an important push for many countries to really sit up and take the voice of the youth seriously. And I think that's a great nudge towards the tipping point, because to reach the tipping point without doing anything is pure stupidity, but to reach tipping point with all of us at the edge of the seat, bracing ourselves and also doing as much as we can to reverse that tipping point. I think that's a different stance that we take altogether. So Singapore has seen these rollouts of the Singapore Green Plan and huge national discourses on inequality, and many spotlights that have been shown on issues of migrant workers as well. I think these are great steps towards the right direction, but we need to continue that traction and to galvanize more people to the mission. And I would say it's never the effort of a single person. It's always been a collective that have enabled whatever that Citizen Adventures and what we're associated with has been able to do. And I think that's also the privilege that I've had of being just that platform. And that's what we hope to continue doing, being that platform for others to leverage on to do more. And we always are fully aware that we are not able to do a lot of things unless people come on board and join us in this cause. And we've learned definitely a lot of lessons on collaboration that I would have never studied in my university masters. And I really do treasure these lessons as well. And yeah, I think to answer the question, like it's really going to involve all hands on deck. And to have the movement continue and gain traction.
I like that you mentioned about the Singapore Green Plan, which is due in 2030. And I mean, going out of the context of Singapore, we also have UN goals. We also have, in Monaco, for example, they also have a carbon neutral plan by 2050, and the Paris plan as well that has been put for 2030, I believe, as well. There's so many global perspectives and plans to be more sustainable. How can we move towards making do with less, and also learn to adapt to the crises that lie ahead?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that there's a crisis up ahead. I think for most of us, especially in Singapore where we lead such comfortable lives, we don't really perceive the problems around us, whether of others or of our environment. That's like, and the environment can't speak, right? So it's like you rely on like data or news articles or mentions by important people enough to like, oh yeah, this person said that, oh, we are going to shits in the environment, so we should do something about it, and therefore not take plastic bags. But that's, I think, the human nature of how we operate. And in Singapore, that's also a status quo that we are very comfortable in, the positions of privilege and income that most of us enjoy, and the nice like settings that we are in often with aircon. But I think that is a very comfortable like stance to take, and I think that's where the call to action is always it comes at a personal impetus, like how do I relate to the issue, how is it important to me, how do I learn how to care or speak the language to care for it. So I think one of the great ways of caring is to talk to children. And like if you have children or if you have friends with children, when you speak to them about like, environmental issues, actually you realize that they are in that position because of us, and a lot of things that we describe to them, the horrors in nature, where we find icebergs melting and all that, their question and the perceptive of innocence and the joys of childhood, it's like it makes you feel a bit guilty or heartbroken, about that state that we have rendered the earth to be. So I think that's a very like macro thing that you can watch on Netflix, environmental programs and all that. But when you speak to a child about it, when you actually process and internalize what it means to us as individuals, actually we realize that there is a lot that we can do. So I think the first step is the internalization of that issue that we care about. The second is really the relevancy of that issue to us. Being in Singapore, for example, our population stats are 2030, 1 out of 4 people here will be above the age of 65. In 2015, that number was 1 out of 10. So we have the silver tsunami, or aging population as they call it by many names, approaching us. But how many of us are having the conversation about caregiving, about death, or about the aging population amongst us, and how do we flip the conversation from one of caregiving to one of empowerment? How do we understand aging as a lifestyle, as a quality of aging, and the life that you lead when you're old as something that should be of priority in discourse, right? So we don't hear much of that narrative, either because like old people don't have a sense of agency to speak for themselves when they're stuck in a nursing home. But I think that for me is the next big thing that I'm concerned about. And it's about the second part is really about the relational, being relational to that, not just in intellectually understanding the problem, but also having a vested interest, because my parents are aging, your parents will age, and collectively the cost of caregiving will be extremely high. And if we don't do something about it, we are the ones that will suffer as well. So yeah, that's really these aspects of society that I'm concerned about, and of course not just in Singapore but in relation to the whole world. So I think these are good ways of introspection to understand ourselves better in that process, understand how we perceive like emergencies or crises impending, and how we also adapt to it. And I think that's the beauty of human nature. We have been adaptive through times, and we will undoubtedly go through this, but it's just how well we fare in that process.
Well said. Give you a round of applause on that.
Please don't.
No, but I really agree with what you say. And I mean, as a social entrepreneur yourself, there's also another, I wouldn't say a problem, but an issue, is that a lot of times social entrepreneurship does not play on the level playing field as much as the major and the bigger players of economy. And in some countries as well, social entrepreneurship is not even recognized. And so how can we equip ourselves to finally play in the big leagues?
Yeah, so I see my work as like a tour guide, as like a farmer, like planting seeds. So I'm planting seeds to grow a forest. Like I'm not planting it for my own harvest. So in that way, it's really about the perception of everyone as seeds of ideas, seeds of action that will one day sprout. Not everyone seeds like sprouts immediately, but my dream is, for every seed that I plant, one day, perhaps someone in a corporation or someone in a place of position of power will be inspired by what they've heard on the tour from someone who has attended the tour, and with that traction, things will change. Yeah, so that's always like the once again the groundswell that's required before change happens. And for me, that's where I see my work as a small function of that. And yeah, we have seen how the different seeds that have germinated, even across just the 7 years that we've been doing this, how they have been relevant to either advocacy for migrant worker issues, or many others who have gone on to find a career in social work, in the very interesting jobs and careers in big corporations, right, that are involved in solving these problems. So I think I'm always happy to have like-minded people who come on the tours and leave inspired, and eventually go on, a career doing what they are passionate about, and that always gives me hope. So I guess my role is just to be an example of someone who can like do this full time and has the privilege of being like not dying in COVID with like financial insolvency, right, with not being able to do tours for 6 months and having zero finances for that period of time. And I think it is a place of privilege, and also retrospectively like being really appreciative of this journey, and still being able to sit here and say that I'm still running the business right now. Yeah.
So what advice would you give to the next generation, and how will you encourage them to continue to fight for a sustainable future, or to even pursue a social entrepreneurship like you did?
So I think to the people who are still in school, like who have the privilege of like education and still like are able to volunteer because it's compulsory for your school, or because in some component in your grades you're marked for that. But I appreciate that how a lot of younger students are reaching out to like say that they want to do a project on like the work that I am involved in, and whether they can interview or help the initiative, to further the cause. And my advice to young people is really to expose yourselves to different volunteers, the different volunteer organizations and different social issues. And being in school is really the best time to experiment, not just with like what you're going to do for a living, but I think the concern is, what are you going to live for? Like, what is your passion? What are you, why do you exist? Or the hard questions of what do you care about and how do you, do that full time? And I think that's always the challenge that I give to people who approach. After you leave, the initiative will disappear because it was a school project. So how do you, challenging that notion, how do you sustain that, whether by continuing the good work that someone else has done, or continue building a resource upon which organizations or other people can take it. And it's really a great time to be exploring your passions and your interests and see what kind of career options that might bring. I think a good thing about the current state is that we do have quite a few jobs, for example, the green sector, or jobs in MNCs which are concerned by social responsibility and the triple bottom line, as they call it, right? So those are great areas to be exploring, especially when one is in school. I think the other thing is not being afraid to fail, especially when you're younger. I think for most of us, we are very concerned about like plans and how they must go according to a plan and a fruition, and some outcomes and objectives must be achieved in that process. If not, you will be considered failing at that project, right? So I think sometimes in our obsession for grades or what people might have the impression of, to a young person, it could be very impeding or degrading if you were graded badly or someone criticizes you about your idea. But rest assured that was exactly what I went through when I thought of doing tours in Geylang. People were just not the most receptive, especially when it's ideas that are not tested before. And I think what I really liked about that process of feedback was in how it really either helps you realize how spectacular your idea you think it is, that no one else agrees with it, and yet you think it's a damn good idea. Or I think it challenges you to really think about what you truly stand for in the idea they're expressing, and that honing of that convincing others that it's a good idea kind of thing really hones your idea, and the kind of feedback that you get really helps make your idea into action and in a realistic way as well. So I really appreciated that process in meeting people who had feedback that was not so good about the ideas that I had. And I guess that's where I am today, right? With collective feedback and process of people who then validate you by joining your cause and support you as well along the way. And I think at some point of time, the realization was that whatever that we're doing is beyond me. It's a platform, and I think that's what young people can also think about. What kind of platforms do they want to create, or do they have on their own? Whether it's through social media, which is a great tool for sharing with your peers about what you care about, or the voice of the next generation that could be virtually communicated, or through ideas, or through subcultures and deeper ways that you speak to one another these days, apart from face to face. So I think these are always exciting avenues that I'm always getting ideas when I speak to youths and young people about. And I think the encouragement is not to let that fire fizzle out in corporate world when you graduate.
Well, clearly those negative and constructive feedback that you had have paid off. Your risk has also paid off, and the sacrifices that you have made has also paid off. You have been nominated for the Singaporean of the Year award by Straits Times in Singapore, and also the Singapore Youth Award. And coming to the end of this podcast, what is next for Yinzhou and what's next for you?
Well, I'm getting married, so thanks. That's what's next in the next couple of months' time, and I think that's also a redefining milestone for me, like personally, to rethink about what do I want to do for the next decade, so in life, right? With the notion of not living for yourself anymore, but having a dependent. as registered on your IC. So I think that's always fun to rise up to the challenge with. But I think in reference to the work that I am still doing and I believe in, I think the challenge is for the social issues that we are concerned about. They are fast evolving, and I think with the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic still being discovered and unraveled, the full destructive impacts of the pandemic has not been fully seen and comprehended yet. And I think that will be something that we'll live to tell our kids one day, as per our parents told us about SARS last time, right? But I think when we get there, I think the reality of the new normal would be quite different from the lives that we have lived back then. So I think for me, the most important thing is to continue the efforts of advocacy in a small seed planting way, and really to think of new ideas that could galvanize people to the cause, and to take the opportunity of this wave of interest to also do more for different populations.
Thank you, Yinzhou. Thank you, Yinzhou, for coming out with the perfect summary. What I got from this conversation was that regardless of the size or the magnitude, our actions and our goals do have an impact in the world. So I have to thank you again for sharing everything with us today on this podcast, and thank you very much for gracing this interview again.
It was my pleasure, Jehang.
And we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.